Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. I'm your host for the day, Srivatsa Subbanna. The Indian power sector is in the midst of a major transformation. With increased industrialization and urbanization, the demand for power in India is going to increase in the coming decades. In June 2017, for the first time in India, the Power Ministry announced that India had become a power surplus nation. However, the sector continues to face several issues. Both access to power and the quality of power supplied to consumers is poor. In addition, about 53% of villages in India received electricity for less than 12 hours a day. Continuous supply of electricity remains a challenge. To discuss some of the challenges and opportunities within this sector, we have with us two experts from this field, Rajat Seksaria and Mudit Jain. Rajat is the CEO of Acme Solar. He manages one of India's largest solar portfolio with more than 5 gigawatts in operational and under development projects. He has over 16 years of experience of working in power, infrastructure, and oil and gas sectors. Hi Rajat, glad to have you on Bharatvaarta. How are you doing?
I am doing fine. Nice to have a discussion on a topic which, as professionals, we are quite enthusiastic about.
Great, look forward to it. Next, we have Mudit Jain. Mudit is a power sector expert with over a decade of experience. Currently, he is the head of research at Tata Cleantech Capital. He's an expert in the India solar PV market and the battery market for both stationary and mobility applications. Hi Mudit, welcome to Bharatvaarta. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, Shiva. So thank you for having me on the call.
Great. So, Mudit, let's start off with you. Can you give us an overview of the current issues within the power sector in India?
So, Shiva, the idea is that the problems are there in each of the verticals, but the biggest bottleneck comes from the distribution side of the things. This is where you ultimately monetize all the assets. So I will not say that the generation and the transmission are free of faults. No, they are not. But then they are still manageable. The problem lies with the distribution side of the things where all the monetization of the power plants has to happen. This is where the real challenge comes through. One of the basic problem here is that our collection efficiency and the billing efficiency, those both of them are very poor. So if you look at the national average, the collection, if I'd say that the billing efficiency would be close to 84%, the collection efficiency is the 92% of the national average. There are some states where these two numbers would be languishing below 80% as well. Now, that's where the challenges comes. You're unable to bill and you're unable to collect from the consumers. At the same time, you have to pay back to the generators as well as to the transmission companies. The cash flow as such is not defined, or rather not supportive of monetizing the real asset whenever we want to put it on. Now, with respect to how we have seen in the past, the distribution has gone through many of the packages, many of the schemes, but none of it helped it fructify to the level where the sector can become sustainable in itself. One of the basic reason here is, once again, the cost is not representative of the revenue which the discoms are earning. 3 or 4 decades back, the distribution companies used to be big profit-making entities of the states, but they are not today. The reason is that only we have a cross subsidization structure as well. But even then, we are unable to reflect the true cost whenever we want to bill it to the consumers. Even if the billing is going through, the same is not getting collected through. Over the years, distribution companies are now buried under the pile of losses and debts. And today, the number, if you are just following it through, in the month of March, the payables were a little over 90,000 crores, for which the Ministry of Power and Ministry of Finance put together has come out with a scheme of under Atmanirbhar Bharat of discom liquidity package. That money has to be supplied through PFC and REC. Under that, they had some reforms, not most, but 50% of the money was payable upfront with the state government guarantee. And then balance 50% would be submitted after they give some reform measures, such as installation of smart meters in government offices, and then digital payment of electricity bills, as well as the overdue of or outstanding dues from the government bodies has to be cleared, or at least a path has to be provided, and a plan has to be submitted for reducing the ACS and ARR gap. However, even with that, that 90,000 has been increased to 1,20,000 crores. Of that, 31,000 crores have been already been disbursed. But today, the receivable has increased to 1,42,000 crores. With the money already been disbursed, there is a definite given condition of between 35,000 crores to 50,000 crores of additional receivables that have been collected in past 9 months. Now, this is where the challenge is. You're not able to recover the cost. How will the sector become sustainable in itself? So, I'm sure we'll be discussing it in more in detail, but the bigger crux here is the distribution companies, and because of which the stress gets transferred to both the transmission companies as well as to the generating companies.
Sure.
And of course, there are some of the bits which can be improved in both of the two, but the 90% of the problems comes from the downstream side of the distribution side.
Sure. I just have a follow-up on that, since you brought about, distribution in such detail. So Uday addressed, some of the issues related to outstanding debts of discoms partially. But really they've not been able to achieve all the goals they were looking for, right? So the technical and commercial losses, the target in 2019 was 15%. Well, it's at 20%. And the gap, between the cost of supplying power and revenue, as you mentioned, is still there. What do you think are, some of the issues, why this is happening and what can be done to improve it?
Right. So, very good scheme, at least on the theory basis. So yes, Uday has been able to achieve the AT&C losses. It used to be 19% plus in 2016. Oh, sorry, it has now reduced to 19%. It used to be close to 27% in 2016. Although the target set was 15%, we are still not there yet. But if you look at Uday, there were two big facets to it. Regarding electricity, historically the issue is that the person who is responsible for the let's say for particular parts is not someone who is actually taking care of it. For example, here for distribution companies, two broad aspects that Uday wanted to answer was improving the collection efficiencies and then reducing the ACS and ARR gap. So what has happened is, for improving the collection efficiencies, you need the state machinery support for collecting it. It's not possible, it's not actually physically possible for the distribution companies guy to reach over to those areas which are not making the payments and hope to recover the same, because you require the police support, you require the government mechanisms and the machinery support to recover the same. Now that was a part which was very well addressed under Uday scheme, in which the same thing has been put on the state's responsibility to recover the same. The second part is, of course, reducing the cost of interest. Now, if state government support comes out to the distribution companies back, it would automatically reduce the interest cost. And if the state governments are facing that particular debt burden onto them, they will have more incentive to reform and then reduce the debt in such a manner that they also show sustainability. However, as you just mentioned, Uday has not been able to give fair dividends. The reasons behind that is it's actually very difficult even for the state governments to pass through their political lines and go for the actual collection mechanism. That is not happening on the ground. On the second front, with respect to reducing the cost, right now the thing is happening is evergreening of the system, in which the problem has been put forward for the next government, and that's where nobody is looking for the future. If I just have to put it, until now the balance of the distribution companies is being financed either by the generating companies or by PFC and REC. Going forward, it could become difficult, where Minister of Power has already announced that for getting the money from PFC and REC, the discoms have to show profitability. That is a long way off for 90% of the discoms in the country. The second thing is with respect to financing from the generating companies. That is where the rule of letter of credit came through. But this letter of credit is like a revolver put on your head. Nobody wants to pull it through. So Rajat can answer that even if you have that LC, you do not want to use it and pull it onto the discom saying that if you don't make the payment, I won't deliver the power. You really can't do that because that is a ecosystem in which you have to operate for the next 2 decades or more. So it's not, although on paper it's really good, but for sustainability you still have to ensure that the cash flows are coming through. However, in essence, it wanted to put it through, but it, even in India today, we have the electricity, water, and road being the primary drivers for any kind of electoral campaign, and no government wants to touch the softer aspect or the most sensitive bits of it.
So Rajat, as someone who is an entrepreneur in this sector, how have things changed in the power sector in the last 5 to 6 years, according to you?
So I think 5 to 6 year in power sector has been a very action filled. In each of these categories, you have a lot of new initiatives, a lot of government interventions, a lot of money now flowing in to the sector, especially on the renewable side of it. So I would say, taking a leap from say how Madhur described it, people would analyze power sector usually from a generation, transmission, and distribution point of view, right? So the generation leg of it is something which has vastly improved in India in last 5 or 6 years, or maybe say 10 years. Just to give you a perspective, till I think 2012 or 13, we were at around 170 gigawatt of power generation, 150 to 170 gigawatt. And today we are at 370 gigawatt of generation capacity. A lot of it is renewable, but 370 gigawatt, probably we are fourth largest in the world, if I'm not mistaken, right? Just to put in that perspective, we are a powerhouse of a country in terms of generation. Someone like a Bangladesh is 21 gigawatt, Pakistan would be 35 gigawatt. So even if you adjust for the population variations, we are way higher in generation capacity. So generation part of it in terms of setting up capacity is something which we have addressed, right? So for next 5 years, if we were to not add a single megawatt of new generation capacity and start sweating these assets to a higher PLF, we don't need any more capacity. So that part in terms of generation capacity is addressed. And if we recollect 2011, 12, 13, even generation was a big issue, right? People were eagerly awaiting when is the next unity being commissioned, when is the next electron flowing from. So that part, I think, is in that sense, in terms of capacity setting up, is kind of addressed for the time being. We need to do more work, but is largely under control. The other part was transmission, right? And this is where I think probably not enough commentary has happened as a country. This is where I think large strides have happened. Today, we have as a country, in genuine sense, one country, one grid. So if you want to have a price of electron in the south of India, it's almost the same as what you get in east of India or north of India, essentially because you have transmission capacity. We had regional grids till 4 5 years back, and that time you had occasions where south of India was generally deficit where power would be 5 6 7 rupees, and you would have power at 3 or 4 rupees in north. So that anomaly in the market has been addressed. And to the extent, the other day when we were discussing with the ministry and the complaint we had from Power Grid, we have set up this large, huge lines, 400 kilowatt and 760 kilowatts, and we are not actually able to use that much of transmission capacity, right? So again, the problem has been reversed. Till 14, 15, Mudit would know we were talking about all these green corridors and large power. So we have lots of them right now, and they are probably not running at the capacity utilization they should be. So we are ending up socializing a lot of this capital cost because they are not being used to the capacity. So transmission capacity was another concern area till 5 years, 6 years back, and to the credit of largely the, I would say, the central ministries, that has been taken care of. You don't hear about too many land problems there, right? Large corridors being set up. So that has happened something relatively silently without too much of noise or too much of political heat generated. So I would say state governments and the central ministries have at some level worked without making too much of issue, and we have large corridors and the work is going on. So that part is again something which I would think is largely addressed right now. Third part is something which continues to be a big area of concern, which Mudit kind of explained in a lot of detail. So I would address, I would kind of add a few more shades on the problem of distribution. See, problem of distribution is that it is end of the day a political will, right? And if you really look at it, since distribution of Delhi Circle almost 20 years back, you have very few examples of any large city going privatized. Surprisingly, Calcutta was actually privatized even before the 2003 Electricity Act, which is surprising being a left bastion, and it is one of the best performing distribution utility in the country. So you have cities like Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, to name a few, still not being distributed, not privatized. And this is where I think no major government from either of the party has been able to kind of take the next leap forward. There has been some development, some effort, two steps forward, one step back, and somehow not many have been able to get that level of political will. One success story in the making is surprisingly Orissa, right? And which I think Tata, other entities involved. And again, probably that didn't grab too many headlines. As a power sector person, I thought that was a big leap. A state like Orissa, not necessarily known for forward-looking reform, has actually just recently, in last few months, under the COVID situation, actually handed over reins of their distribution company to Tata entities, right, and two large circles. So that is something which I think happened without too much of political noise, too much of hue and cry, too much of hartals. So I am hoping that would give clue to other state governments to kind of go for that change that is required. Because once you start addressing distribution, you have a very good story to build. You have demand which is growing, you have residential demand which is growing, people generally consuming more electricity, people having more ACs, office demand goes. So that story is intact. Once you kind of set this house in order, which the Electricity Act, when we discuss the reform part of it, will come. They're trying to address one bit. Other aspect which I think is crucial and which again probably doesn't get enough scrutiny is, in itself, when the 2003 Electricity Act was designed, it had answers to a lot of these problems. You had state regulators who were supposed to take care of all these issues. You were supposed to disbundle all these entities. Unfortunately, what has happened, uh, the state regulators have effectively become the political extended arms of the respective state governments, right? It is,
Yeah.
to give you a very rough parallel, it's like a governor being appointed by central government, playing, or the state speaker being appointed by a particular party. So in essence, it's supposed to be an independent body, but that's effectively become a semi-political body, and that's kind of played along with the state governments, and they have become innovative in a infamous way, right? So you have concepts of regulatory assets, where if you don't pay the money, create something on books called regulatory asset and pass on to the problem to the next set of government, which I think Mudit kind of mentioned. So that is something which I think is not enough positive action has yet happened, which we required. A couple of other positive things which I think I am quite enthusiastic about is, we are now having something called smart metering, and interestingly, states like UP and probably Bihar are the ones who are going to lead on that. So that set of reform is something which kind of would partially address some of the distribution issues that we are seeing. So that is something which needs to be watched at, and that success could kind of partly address some of the issues we have. So this is something which on the general side, but a couple of other positives I would enter is renewables is something, when we discuss in detail, is something which has become really talk of the time and real action driven area. A lot of investment coming. We as a country has marketed it well. The Prime Minister has marketed it well. So at times, I almost feel that we have marketed it much better than what the story potentially could be, right? So that is something which we are seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of new money coming, entrepreneurs coming. So that continues to be a shining spot. But yes, lots of action, some good, some not so good. But yeah, the flux continues.
Mudit, would you like to add on to that?
So, I mean, Rajat has added onto the part regarding the power transmission. 5 to 6 years back, we have only PGCIL as the central player, which was time consuming. Uh, they used to allot the projects on the EPC model. Now we are seeing, at least on the interstate transmission system, it has been made under the PPP model. The cost has come down. The ROW process has been simplified. On the renewable energy side, we have moved on from feed-in tariff to competitive auction and bids, where the cost has come down significantly faster than expected. We have seen emergence of solar and wind park, and we have seen strategic capital coming onto the countries with strategic players setting up shops in India, where we have all the fundamentals to increase the capacity. Even by, let's say, we can increase the capacity by 3 times of the current rate without really worrying about the capital. Only thing is that we just need to address the distribution side of the things. Everything else Rajat has added very beautifully.
Great. So, Rajat, coming to you for the next question. You briefly spoke about renewables. Mudit also covered it. How has the whole renewable sector progressed in India? If you were to look at, say, the last decade or so.
Yeah. So I think in the renewable story, I'll take a slightly almost a provocative stance politically. So a lot of us credit, say, Prime Minister Modi when he was in Gujarat, or now that he has set up the vision, and that all credit probably is justifiable and no cons with it. One thing which I thought in the renewable story happened in 2010, which the previous government and the MNRE then did quite well, was when they started the National Solar Mission. They did what was called, which was the antithesis of a winner takes all kind of a situation. So what they did was they started small, but they started in a way where everyone gets some capacity. So the L1 tariff is not who wins. So someone can get only as much capacity, and then the next guy gets, and the next guy gets. So what that did was that, so you had started with 5 megawatt, but you had 30 players being awarded the project initially, right? So the 30th player probably gets a higher tariff than what the first player gets on the basis of bidding, but that innovation helped in creating a large ecosystem. So it did two things. Initially, when we started, you didn't have the large name like say Tatas or the Adanis or the Reliances heading there, because the size was small. You actually had small entrepreneurs coming, right? So you started with 5 megawatt, then it was 20, 50, and now we are talking about 500 megawatt. So the initial start actually led to creation of an ecosystem rather than one or two player industry, and that allowed a lot of innovation. That allowed a lot of entrepreneurs coming in, a lot of cost innovation, engineering innovations, project fast ramp up, right? And the dividends of that start is something which we are reaping from last 5 6 years, because you don't have the names that you hear in renewables are not the conventional names. You will hear players like Azure, Acme, Renew, right, Greenco. So these are entrepreneurs who created themselves purely on the basis of this entrepreneur revolution. So that thing that we started resulted in this ecosystem being created, separated capital on this companies coming in, gushing in. And today we have reached a stage where we have actually driven down the cost, right? So cost driven driving down has not happened purely because the capital cost have come down in terms of panels coming down, but a lot of innovation has happened in India, right? So, so what everyone knows that the solar panels cost have come down, but probably little people talk, the balance of plant is actually come down almost as steeply, right? Today we can do a whole power plant in 3 crores, 3.5 crores a megawatt. When I did my first plant in 2010, it was a 14, 15 crores a megawatt, right? So this capital cost has actually meant that today when we sell renewable power, we are not selling save the world power. We are actually saving power which is commercially competing with anything else, right? So I can today compete with coal or gas on the power of my commercials, not because someone has subsidized me somewhere. And this inflection point is something which we achieved in around 2017-18, when we kind of surpassed, at that time the popular word was grid parity, right? So that was a big event when we actually came below 3 rupees, and at 244, my company Acme was the one who made headlines at that point in time, 2 rupees 44 paisa. A lot of people were actually worried whether it will destroy the sector or not, whether this was self-defeating. And the success story is we actually commissioned that plant in Badla, and today it's running for almost 2 years. And now we have actually broken that 2 rupees 44 ceiling, and the latest round we actually hit 2 rupees, right? So renewable success story is a success story which is created because of an ecosystem we have created. Today we have industry clusters which support it. So it's not about the developers. You have a complete backend system which has been created. One anecdote that I keep giving to everyone, when I visited places like Jodhpur and Jaisalmer in 2010, and today when I visit that place, the alternate theory, the alternate example that comes to mind is almost like the Texan oil revolution which happened in 1800s. So that place, if you see the big cars, you generally see prosperity. And when you execute projects even in other parts of country, it has players from those areas, the sub vendors from those areas who actually go and do. They have now achieved a level of efficiency, the level of productivity, and which has kind of become the benchmark. And now that has become the ground zero. Jodhpur, Jaisalmer, that is where now the large projects are coming. So this is an ecosystem which has developed of suppliers, of financiers, of developers, which is where I think when Mudit said we can triple the size, because we have now created that strong base. Doing 30, 40 gigawatts a year is not difficult. Today we are probably doing around 15 gigawatts a year, 10 to 15 gigawatts, which by the way is probably second or third largest in the world. So we can easily do 30, 40, 50 gigawatts a year. It doesn't take challenge. Money is also available. But now I need to ensure, one, I have the demand, which is economic demand, which is ability to pay and willingness to pay, right? And then there is a technical challenge which during your podcast we'll discuss is, after a point renewable has its handicaps of being dependent on particular generation hours. So that is the next technological and commercial leap, or the structural leap which we'll have to take. But this sector, as someone has really come leaps and bounds. People generally tend to be younger, so a 20-year experience doesn't mean anything in this, right? Because probably a 10-year experience or 5-year experience is more valuable, because the sector itself is 10-year old,
Yeah.
right? So if someone comes and tells 20-year, that doesn't count for anything. So
Yeah.
this in a way is the young people being there is something which young industry being there. The financing side, when you see you have young people, entrepreneurs are relatively young. So this kind of is quite exciting, and a lot of innovation happening on the financing side, on technical side. So a lot of analytical work happening in forecasting, right? So it has a full plethora of activities which it is bringing. So it's not a fuddy-duddy old sector, no one interested. It has a lot of exciting bit, which kind of is attracting a lot of people into it.
So this leads me nicely to the next question I had. We've reached a stage where we are seeing good growth in renewables. So what are the challenges for further growth of renewables? Mudit, if you could answer that.
Right. So, Rajat, as the point Rajat just mentioned, so we have all the good fundamentals in the country, but as he has also previously mentioned, our power demand is not growing as expected before. So even though we have the capacities sitting with us, we are not really utilizing it. Then to add new renewables, you really need to create the new demand. So the new government started with the idea of Make in India that really did not yield dividends on the ground. Until that happens, the new power demand will not come through. And without this new power demand, this renewable will not really be utilized in full. The coal PLFs are anyways down to historic lows. There is very little probability of it going down significantly from the current levels. So the first fundamental problem with respect to the power demand growth. Although the talk has been on for exporting the power outside the country, but that is still some time away. So the first challenge really is the power demand. The second is with respect to addressing the congestion or the curtailment. We have recently launched a report on the grid congestion as an issue. So what is happening in the country today is that even though we have good fundamentals of both solar and wind in most parts of the country, the capacities are concentrated in 8 of southern and the western regions. So these 8 states account for more than 90% of the installed capacity for the at least the wind, and for most part of the solar as well. Now this is where the challenge is, because you don't really have that demand in those places and you really need to transmit the power out. Although we have a very good connected grid, but still on the local level it creates a problem of congestion and eventually curtailment. Although we have a system of must run status, but states do use it as a system of they masquerade the commercial losses under the technical ones and then they curtail the power. But then the idea is we have a twin peak system in the country, but solar and wind do not really support in that kind of a grid structure. So eventually we will have to address this grid related issue, in which the power once produced can be consumed without really creating the stress on to the transmission side of things. This is where the second challenge of renewable would come, that today renewable is dependent upon coal in India for supplying because it requires the balancing and the spinning reserves. Going forward, if storage doesn't kicks in, then we may have to see some kind of a balancing, or even the demand side pattern needs to change. The KUSUM scheme can be one of the good thing here, in which the power demand can be matched with that of the solar. But in reality, we have twin peaks, one in the morning hours, one in the evening hours. But the generation of solar is in the afternoon, and for wind, it's basically the morning and the night time. So we sort of miss the peak time. And for this peak, we still have to be dependent on the conventional power plants and then continue to depend on for providing the balancing as well as the spinning reserve. So these are the two main challenges for the sector to grow. Of course, the other part of the commercial side, which we have just discussed now, the distribution reforms needs to be there. Financing is anyways coming. The green bond market is opening up. Financing will not be a challenge going forward if we address the distribution. But regarding these two technical parameters of creating the demand and then creating the balancing as well as the spinning reserves. So the work is still out. So CRC and CEA has come out with papers for opening up the ancillary services market. They have started discussing the potential of storage coming through, but it's a race against time. How quickly can we expand our systems in such a direction and in such a bit so that we can continue to move forward?
Great. Thanks for the detailed response, both Rajat and Mudit. Rajat, specifically coming to solar, uh, what do you think needs to be done in terms of infrastructure to promote solar? Considering that large parts of our country have sun, which is abundantly available.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's a good, you know, good thing that we need to discuss, because I'll tell you few aspects which are not which are counterintuitive. So you are right that India has abundant sunlight, especially parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat and some other places. But there is one misconception. Uh, Sunlight and temperature are two variables which are at play. So while we have very good sunlight, but we also have high temperatures, right? And for people who may not know, there is a negative coefficient with temperature. So as you move, say, from 25 degree to 50 degree, there is almost at 10 to 15% reduction in what you generate power, because that's the chemistry of the modules that you produce. So when I entered the sector, I also thought that India is very, very blessed with sunlight and we have the highest resources. So that is actually partially true. I would say if you really look at it, we are mid-level country in terms of technical solar radiation which can generate power. So
Very interesting.
yeah, so just to give an example, a place like say Oman, which is probably with the same thing, it can generate 20% more power, right? With the same, because their irradiance is higher, right? And some of the Chile or Australia is probably 40% higher than India, because the combination of both temperature and sunlight is ideal. So this is just to, yes, we have good resources. It's still average or average above average, but it's not the best in the world that a lot of us otherwise tend to believe, because we are a hot country. So hot is actually negative for solar production. And that is why, and another interesting anecdote, places at Leh are actually probably more solar generating than it would be in Rajasthan. What works for us is places in Rajasthan and Gujarat, we have lots of cheap land available, unutilized land available, barren land available, right? Which I think is a extremely good positive, which we are now harnessing, and that is why the role of this large transmission networks which are being set up. So you have large evacuation facilities which are there or being set up to evacuate this power from generation center to the demand centers, which I would generally think is the work is on track, though there is anxiety because lots of new power is coming up. So hopefully new generation capacity, transmission capacity also needs to come up with that speed. But by and large, evacuation is happening. All the plants that I have are running at more than 99.8% uptime in terms of evacuation happening. So right now it's not a big concern. Uh, Concern is what probably Mudit mentioned in terms of congestion is usually a dishonest approach by some of these distribution companies to curtail power. The reasons are not necessarily technical. The reasons are actually more commercial, right? So you don't follow what is called a merit order dispatch while you have renewable power. So, but sometimes this older PPAs tend to be at higher cost, so they actually don't want to buy this higher cost power and they curtail power in disguise of calling it technical congestion. The answer to the growth, which is a more lateral answer, is that we are right now thinking solar and we are thinking solar in terms of power. That is not going to solve our problem. So the answer there is electricity today is only 25-30% of our primary energy consumption. So how do we make it higher share of the energy wallet, right? And which is where I think we have a potential to do a new breakthrough, and which is where probably next 2 years you will hear some exciting stories happening even in India. Let me give one specific example, and which personally I'm very excited about. A lot of policymakers are excited about, and this you will hear a lot about. So you need not transfer power as electrons. If I generate power, I can convert into something called hydrogen and green hydrogen to be specific, right? So we as company Acme are right now as we speak setting up one first plant in Bikaner, which hopefully if all goes well by March or April next year will be the first plant in India. So what you do is use power and convert that into hydrogen. Hydrogen can then be blended into natural gas, right? And this is where I think some background policy making is happening. We are helping other industry players happening, and probably as early as so in next 6 months we may have one of the first tenders announced. So what that would do is, I have power, I generate hydrogen, and it's called green because it's using generated using uh, green electricity or renewable electricity. 80% of the cost in generating hydrogen is actually electricity cost, right? The processes are already there, but it's a very power intensive process. You use electricity, and then if you can blend it for 5% or 10% on natural gas, which by the looks of it, by the initial study appears it technically feasible without any change in the infrastructure, then you actually open up a whole new market for solar or any renewable power, right? And once that happens, and if that experiment is successful, then you can really expand. So where do you use? So hydrogen is the very intense carrier of energy, very uh, uh, high density carrier of energy, right? The problem is hydrogen you can't carry long distances
Mm.
because of its nature. So either you can blend with gas. There is another carrier of hydrogen which people are not talking about. It's called ammonia, NH3, right?
Yeah.
It's and now we again get into what is called green ammonia concept, right? So you convert it to hydrogen, then you convert into ammonia, and then ammonia opens up a whole new plethora of applications. You have urea, which uses a lot of
Yes.
ammonia. You have a lot of process industry which uses this ammonia, where you can displace them, right? So if you start moving there towards this, it solves two problems. It creates a much larger pie for your energy consumption, and two, because there is a cyclic nature of both the solar and wind, you can generate these entities based on the demand that power has. So whenever the power demand is not there, you can actually use that power to generate, say, hydrogen or green ammonia, and then you get into a lot of new exciting application. And that is where the third interesting bit comes in. Today gas and ammonia is actually denominated or sold in dollar terms. So gas is, for example, denominated dollar per MMBTU, right? Similarly, ammonia as a dollar per unit value. And the moment you get a dollar-based pricing for power, your cost of power comes down even further, because then you can get dollar-based loan. Today, if I'm getting loan at say 9 to 10%, if I can get it 5 to 6%, once I know my revenue is also dollar denominated, this 2 rupees actually comes back to 1.5 rupees or 1.7 rupees, and that again becomes a new set of enabling parameter which
Mm.
further entrenches it, right? So this development, which again is not been talked about, is potentially can be the next leap that we are looking at.
Great, great. Thanks for that detailed explanation, Rajat. So, Mudit, one of the things you had mentioned on solar is, the storage bit, and also there is this whole thing around solar panels, and we import a lot of this stuff, right? And one of the things that the Prime Minister keeps talking about is manufacturing in India or Atmanirbhar Bharat. So do you think at some point in the near future, India can become like a manufacturer of solar panels and batteries and so on? What will it take for us to achieve that?
Look, it's not as if we were not used to be a manufacturer in India. We were one of the leading manufacturers in 2008 and 8, 9, 10 for solar panels. But what has happened is that China, if you look at how they function, they subsidize the sector to such an extent that they are able to dump and destroy the industries elsewhere in the world. They have done the same thing with telecom. They've done the same thing with solar. They want to do the same thing with batteries. So I'll just take an example for the telecom. I mean, the for 3G, basically everything has been made in European Union. And 4G, all the suppliers are now Chinese, and 5G is a standard for which no other country has the wherewithal to even come out with the technicalities. Same thing they have done with solar. So they subsidize the sector to such an extent that no other country or no other company could have even competed in those terms. Having said that, the subsidies are now withdrawn from China. And if we look today, many people have the question that we have already missed the bus. That's not the reality. We are still on the cusp of installing solar. We are less than a tenth of what we should install in the next 10 years. In that scenario, yes, we do need to start manufacturing. And Indian government is already talking about the two aspects. One is providing the capital support. Second is providing the protectionist mechanism for creating the ecosystem as well as the demand side. Now here the thing is, we need to start manufacturing, yes. The problem is the cost structure. Today if we see that our cost is basically 30% higher than that of China in terms of manufacturing it alone. Now we need to compete and we need to do it on scale. Right now, we only have some part of cell and most in module, which is really only a garage shop. We really need to move on the upstream basis, and if not polysilicon, at least start with the ingot and wafer, and then move forward to the solar cell bit, and then module, of course. Now, this is something which I believe is definitely possible if government gives the demand visibility for at least a decade, the policy visibility for at least a decade, the competitive landscape for a decade. The short-term policies such as safeguard duties will not help because this is only for 2 years. It's not something which is good enough for a new manufacturer to come in. So what we need is a long-term policy scenario and initiatives for setting up the shops. And it's not something that we need to be dependent on the import for the next decade. Yes, we will have to set up the shop in India for at least the solar side. You are also mentioning about the batteries. Now, this is something where R&D is playing bulk of the role. And regarding this R&D, it's not as if China is leading alone. There are other countries, including Korea, European Union, as well as US, which are pitching in a bulk of the work in these lines. And India will have to move towards an ecosystem creation for both solar as well as battery. It will not be a standalone manufacturing unit which can sustain. So it will require the support from the entire ecosystem creation. Now, this is just one side of the story. We'll need other reforms as well, probably going into a labor reforms. That is something which is not so talked about issue because it's sensitive, but we really require the labor reforms to compete in today's context. We require electricity reforms because the industries need that kind of a support structure. We cross subsidize the residential and agriculture, but developed countries subsidize the industries. Even China subsidizes the industries, and we have to have the competitive nature even in the electricity reforms. The third bit is about the land reforms and then the approvals part of the things. So for manufacturing, it's irrespective whether solar or battery, we need these reforms. But coming on to solar and battery alone, yes, we do have the fundamentals, but we need to still create the ecosystem and then the long-term policy scenarios for making it.
Sure. So you mentioned about the electricity reforms. So we briefly spoke about the new Electricity Act, right? So can you cover it for us in more detail in terms of what are the key changes it proposes and what could be the potential impact?
Right. So Electricity Amendment Act has a wonderful thing, although some of the parts were already covered in Electricity Act, but not really actually got functioned or implemented onto the ground. Here, the thing is that the tariff adoption will be within 60 days. The second good bit is about the renewable purchase obligation being part of the National Renewable Energy Policy. So today, states have the flexibility of setting up their own RPOs. After this, it would become central. Here, this letter of credit, as we were talking about, will become a law in which the SLDCs cannot really dispatch the power, and it will not be only the developer's responsibility to dispatch the power or stop the power. It will be the state load dispatch centers who can stop the power if the letter of credit is not clear. Then this contract enforcement authority was proposed to be set up. So just to take you a live example of Andhra Pradesh unilaterally decided to renegotiate the PPAs that have been entered after the competitive bidding. And most of the stress in the sector is created because of that. We do not have a contract enforcement authority, and even after the APTEL's order, nothing was clear. It is still pending in the court. So this electricity contract enforcement authority would be a good step forward, in which all the disputes have to be settled within a span of 120 days. The most important reform here will be with respect to the subsidy transfer. What happens today is, I'm not talking about the cross subsidy alone, I'm talking about overall subsidization. So initially when this paper came out, the document at least said that it would be a flat tariff for all consumers, and whatever subsidy, that cross subsidization bid for agriculture and the residential consumers, will have to be supplied through by the states. But later the tact has been changed because this act has faced a lot of reservations from the states. Now they are saying cross subsidy will still continue, but it will have to be restricted to 20%. But any kind of subsidy will have to be transferred from the state's coffer from at the start of the year into the respective accounts. It's not the bank accounts, the respective accounts, the electricity accounts of the consumers. What this would help in that is the distribution companies will not have to continue to make losses, because this is something which is already covered. It will have to be cost plus. They will not have to wait for the subsidies which usually come at the end of the year and continue to pay interest on it. Third, they will not have to keep on increasing the tariffs of the C&I consumers by subsidizing it perennially. It would also open up the open access sector, which is currently marred by the lot of regulatory and policy scenarios which doesn't allow it. It will also allow the discoms to open up the sub-licensee areas, because now they will not have to depend upon the C&I consumers funding their balance need. However, one thing which was not still part of the document, but which Minister has discussed, is putting a clause in which the SERCs or the state electricity regulatory commissions would have a clause in which they can be automatically removed if they do not follow the land of the law. As Rajat has mentioned previously, they are performing as an extended arm of the government today, rather than being a quasi-judicial body as they were envisaged to be. In this particular Amendment Act, Minister is talking about adding a clause in which, if the rules are not passed in accordance of the law, it would be a ground for automatic removal of the regulator. Today, they do not have an accountability. They can pass any kind of law which can get overturned in the APTEL or higher courts. They do not have an accountability. It could ultimately be passing on the buck to someone else, and 2 years later, the developer is also in a stress, and whenever he gets the order in his favor, it's not really helping him. So these are the most important things which could come on. Having said that, many states which are led by the opposition has not really shown support of it. Even they have gone to the extent of saying that they are talking about taking the entire subsidy out of agriculture and residential. That's not true. They are talking about states being responsible for the subsidy rather than the distribution companies being responsible for the same. But all of it right now is hanging in the air, and if it gets passed through in the format in which it was originally envisaged, we may see some sustainable steps going towards making the distribution companies stress-free.
Great. Thanks for that detailed explanation, Mudit. So one of the other programs that has been launched that was launched last year was the KUSUM program, which looks to solarize agriculture in some way. So Rajat, can you broadly talk about the program and what are your thoughts? Is this the way ahead, for agriculture to go more solar?
So on the Electricity Act, Mudit has covered the overall thing. There are you know there are three things. Three is very thematic, right? The if someone who understands the sector and nuances of the sector will very clearly understand the whole act is an exercise in ensuring discipline at the level of states, right? There is nothing which was not there, but what has happened, this has happened teach to more central bodies, so that the state regulators or the state governments uh, are kept in check, right? So politically, when you have this theme, it will always be very difficult to get over this, because you can always make generic level arguments that this is encroaching into the powers of state. The federal structure is that uh, is now being diluted, right? So someone who doesn't understand the nuance, and if you were to take generic argument, you will always find arguments against the clauses which have been introduced. And I'll go into those clauses. So if you ask me, frank point blank answer, does it dilute the powers of the state? Yes, it does, right? But why it does it? Because the distribution, which everyone is in sector recognizes is the problematic area, is more a domain of the state, and that is where all the problems are emanating. That is where if one state government doesn't enforce a contract, it creates a negative impression on the sector, which then affects everyone, including the central government, right? In renewable sector, while the story is largely positive, there is a couple of state governments, or one state government in particular, which has started reneging on the contract, and that is the only question which I get asked, or the ministers get asked, when any investor is there, right? So you can always argue that electricity is always meant to be in concurrent list. Let's not. So when you start making generic argument, you will find flaws in the conception. But if you get on the nuance and the practical aspects, this actually tries to address the core of it, right? Three things it addresses. Number one, there is a separate talk of a contract enforcement agency, right? Which hitherto was being taken care by the state regulator. So you are now creating a parallel body, and that is not something which has been appointed by a state government, and that is given a power of a civil court, which can then be challenged in APTEL. So you are actually effectively demoting the SERC, saying, guys, you have not been successful in enforcing the contract. We have someone with more teeth, probably less political body, which gets out there. So this is the key clause. So whenever this act comes, first 2 years, there will be confusion. There would be territorial wars. Some regulators will start saying it is my domain. Courts will jump in. It will create a initial chaos, but eventually, if this comes good, this will be a good development. Secondly, how do you appoint the regulators, right? If the regulators were appointed in the spirit in which they were supposed to be appointed, we still not have that problem. So now we talk about appointing the regulators not through a state government process. Right now there is a central government nominee, a state government, but and I think, if I'm not mistaken, retired judge of a high court is the regulatory chief. So eventually there is window shopping about who gets appointed. You can always get persons who are aligned. Now this talks about either a Supreme Court judge, or in the latest variation, which I've heard, probably the selection committee will now have the acting Chief Justice of the High Court, right? So they have tried to reduce the political influence in the people they have appointed. Right now, we all know in the sector what really happens. Even before a case goes, we already know what that regulator is going to actually come out with a judgment. Third part, and which I think Mudit mentioned, which I think again is important, we are talking about direct benefit transfer. Now the nuance here is, even today there is a case, right? So when we say free electricity for farmers, it is not the distribution company which has to bear the cost. It is under the impression that for whatever is the cost which is attributable for paying, supplying to agriculture, that will actually be paid by the state government. Fine, but the state government doesn't pay. They pay at their whims and fancies, right? They will not pay for 6 months, 9 months, year. So that is something which becomes a big challenge. So what the act says is, state governments are well within their right to subsidize it. They're not challenging that. But for whatever subsidy, please ring fence the distribution companies for it. Please pay them in advance, right? So now what they're trying to do is, the moment right now the state government doesn't pay to a distribution company, that doesn't create that much of hue and cry. But now a distribution company will charge the customer needs to be paid. So now it becomes politically difficult for state governments to not release that subsidy, right? So these are the core problems we have. Anyone in the sector knows it. Everyone knows it. But it is a political hot potato, which this act tries to address in a very, very sincere way. You may almost call it a ham-handed and iron fist manner. And that is the reason this bill has not gone through yet. It has been in the talk for 3 to 4 years. And I think as observers, both commercial and political, it will be interesting to see whether the government presently has the political will or the capital to actually deploy and pass this act. These are these are going to create huge hue and cry. So let's not you know have any second thought about it. Uh, but because it goes to the core of the problem, so we'll see how it happens. But I think this is going to be a seminal moment if this actually goes through for the sector. uh, I am not holding my breath, to be honest, right? Because uh, uh, I don't know how much of the political capital government wants to deploy. Already we are seeing in the big reform agriculture, it has got a lot of pushback, which hopefully they will be able to overcome. Do they have the gumption to take up another big reform, which will, without doubt, be spinned by people to be meant as anti-farmer, anti-reform? So let's see. We are watching, as from the sidelines, what happens. And finally, before I think Mudit gives you details of the KUSUM. KUSUM is a very, very innovative scheme. It again tries to address the elephant in the room. What do you about agricultural subsidies? So it tries to create a framework where the subsidies in a way are kind of taken care by them, farmers generating their own power, or using solar panels to for their solar pumps, right? So whereas 20% of the power in India is for agriculture, which we all of us know is not remunerative, which are not cost reflective. So what it tries to do is reduce that burden and create that ecosystem, right? The challenge there is, again, this is a scheme which large chunk of money is coming from central government, but has a lot of involvement of state government. So the only guys I feel are excited about this scheme right now are the people who manufacture solar pumps. They think the demand is coming, and demand has actually started coming up, or the domestic module manufacturers, or people who will do this small work. So the ecosystem, which should have been the secondary beneficiaries, are the ones who are already happy. Whether the primary purpose is served or not, something probably Mudit can throw more light on it, and probably time will throw also more light on that.
Right, Rajat. I mean, just to append to it, actually, of late, the KUSUM schemes, uh, the contour has been changed a bit. So what
Okay.
they are saying now is that they will talk about the solarization of the agricultural feeder. It's not about solar pumps alone. It's basically the solar plants of 500 kilowatt to 2 megawatt in different feeders, which would feed to the solar or the agriculture feeders, where the electricity would be supplied during the daytime. Today, what happens? The electricity for the farmers are usually supplied during the night in most places of the country, because that is the time when the base load plants are running and the power is at the cheapest. So Rajat is already saying that it's not remunerative, that nobody wants to supply the power. That's when this basically the no use power, or basically the extra or addended power, is basically supplied to the farmers at the night time. What they're trying to do is shift them to that solar generating hours, so that they can still continue to manage the grid, as well as provide the power to the farmers during the daytime, and use this as a something in which the quality of the life of farmers are improving. They do not have to stay up late at night and then worry about the snakes and the other things. They can do the farming during the day by using solar as a power to supply the electricity to the regular feeders during the working hours. For that, idea is right, in which some part of the tariff would come from central government as subsidy. The balance the states will have to keep on funding, and then the developers will come out and set up the power plants. Where the challenge is that, first, the structure is weak. They're still dependent upon the state discoms for getting paid. And that is, as we all know, that particular company is anyways short of funds. They do not have the funds to spare on this. The second part here is, it will be connected on the rural feeders of 11 kV and below. And if the tariffs are not remunerative for the distribution companies, they can still continue to curtail the power under the assumption of the technical grids. See, the sizes are such that without scale benefit, you will not get the professional capital. And the small players could ultimately will have higher cost of capital, higher installation cost, higher O&M cost, and ultimately the cost of supply could be higher, rendering the entire program as useless. So first tender in MP is currently out of 100 megawatt. We'll see how it happens. But for the sector or for this particular scheme to progress, first of all, I think that this particular scheme is really good in addressing both the grid related issues as well as supplying the power when the need is there. And they wanted to move away from the solar pump regime because this was making that water tables dry. They want to supply the regular power, but then regular power should be available during the day instead of the night. And from solar pumps, they are now shifting to solarization because we have seen that the solar pumps have been heavily subsidized and that is running the table dry. So they wanted to have the regular systems flowing around. They've increased the target to 30 gigawatt under this solar feeder alone. But functioning of it will require strong structure and professional capital. The route will be open for many more reforms in this sector.
Great. Okay, moving on to the next question, Mudit. So one of the things the government has announced is privatization of discoms in union territories. Do you think it will happen sometime in the near future? What are the timelines we are looking at?
Look, they wanted to privatize it because the collection efficiencies and the billing efficiencies were very poor. They wanted to go for the smart meter. They wanted to go for prepaid meter. None of it was working in the government constructs. That is the reason why they wanted to privatize it. That at least their billing efficiencies and collection efficiencies would be such that the cost would be recovered. But the case of Chandigarh is right in front with us, in which High Court has stayed the particular process out. The guidelines have been issued, the tenders have been issued, the bidders have shown their interest, the EOIs have been submitted. But if the court will take its own sweet time to determine whether the privatization is even allowed or not, and we cannot really come to a timeline bit of it. Unless and until these things are clear, the next steps are anyways murky. Having said that, this is the way forward in which at least the political cost can still be standardized. In Delhi, if we just see, yes, the prices are low. Look, the thing is that the electricity cost has not been increased in many of the states. In Tamil Nadu, not for 3 years. Andhra Pradesh is not even increasing it now, despite facing so much losses. In Delhi, also, the cost has not been increased for past 5 years. Even then, the distribution companies in Delhi are not making losses. The reason is that they are provided with this regulatory asset for which they regularly submit their application with the DERC in advance that this is the money which has to be paid. This is the interest which have to be collected. All of it is fair and followed. They are not under the state's pressure to not really make profits. Now, this is the way forward, of course, I would believe so. But a lot of it will depend upon how exactly this High Court case will perform out, and God forbid it if even after the ruling it reaches Supreme Court. But if favorable law is passed, I believe that in the next financial year we'll see all union territories got privatized discoms. I mean, this is just a hope. Rajat can supplement his views about his hope, whether he is hopeful or not on those lines.
Yeah, Rajat, would you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I want to add. See, I don't share a bit of gloom on Mudit on this thing. I think it was a good thing that Chandigarh High Court stayed it, and uh, let me be very careful over the words I choose. From whatever I understand of law and what happens, the grounds on which the High Court has stayed the order, there is no doubt in my mind this matter is going to be with Supreme Court soon. And Supreme Court, I am hoping, from what I understand, because the grounds Chandigarh, that High Court is taken, there is what is the reason to privatize, right? So my sense is when such cases have come in Supreme Court, they have taken a very clear call. It's an executive decision. It is a good thing that stated, because when it comes to Supreme Court, and then when Court gives a particular order, then that becomes, a law which is now verified by courts, right? So a lot of time when a new law comes, somehow, with my experience, I have seen it's a good thing if the case comes initially, right? Because now in India, because we have such a check and balance system, that eventually everything is going to be tested in court. So better to be that test to happen immediately at the start, because once that gets strict and then you are on the process, there are less number of roadblocks. So at least a legal roadblock at that point in time, the probability comes down, right? So my from what I read of the sector, it's a matter of time before it gets to Supreme Court and hopefully a decision comes in which case there should be a legal clarity. But once that happens, I think it's a smart thing to do that government has chosen the UTs to be done fast, because state doing in the state is a bigger political challenge, right? So UTs, you don't have assembly elections, for example, most UTs, right?
Yeah.
All UTs, in fact. So I think that's a low hanging fruit, though in terms of size, it's very small. It probably constitutes less than 2% of the overall power distribution that happens in India. But once you start having more success stories, right? My hope is at some point in time, it would become a point of inflection where it is no more a big political hot potato, right? The example that comes to my mind when Delhi and Mumbai airports were being privatized in 2007, and that was such a hue and cry, but somehow politically government showed the will and eventually they went through it. And today, privatization of airport is not seen as a big political boogie, right? So now you progressively have more airports being privatized because the user sees the benefit of it, right? Same way as you have more success stories on the distribution side, that will create grounds for more people actually taking that leap. And that is why the Orissa example I mentioned, in my view, is probably a more significant example in UTs, because consumption in that one two circles that Tata is one would be much more than the all UTs combined. And if you have a state like Orissa, which is not necessarily known for very progressive reform doing it, then what stops from an Andhra or a Telangana or a Karnataka or other states doing it, right? So that is my big hope, that you have these success stories, and in next 5 to 10 years, you have this distribution story reforms in terms of privatization happening. And one more point which probably we missed, in the new Electricity Act, there is another enabling framework for getting private players in distribution. So they have given a sanctity for a franchisee model, right? Earlier, the franchisee model, in my understanding, was a bit confused. Again, some success stories, some failures. But now I think what it allows is you can have a state discom, but then it can sub-franchisee it, and a lot of power of distribution companies can then be transferred there. So that probably gives a slightly a path for privatization happening with probably a lower political bar, lower jump to be made. So that can also be a good story which can be continued if the reforms go through.
Great. So, which brings me to the last question. I'll come to both of you on this one. So, Mudit, what are you hopeful about in the coming years when it comes to the power sectors?
As the popular saying is, "Ummeed pe duniya kayam hai." We are very hopeful about the sector coming through. So yes, there are some bits and pieces on the transmission and the generation side, but on the distribution, I'm hopeful, even at least in the diluted form, the Electricity Amendment Act would get passed. There will still be some gaps, but then those gaps would be filled subsequently. We have come a long way forward. Progressively, with court orders or with respect to the laws, our systems keeps on getting better. We'll continue to improve, even if it does not get passed through in its current scheme of things. At least bulk of it could get addressed. Some parts will be addressed in next 5 to 10 years. We are talking about the carriage and the content being separated. That may or may not happen, but if it does, the sector would open up in such a manner that a lot of private capital could come in and bits and pieces. Ancillary services can get created. Our transmission systems would get improved. Our distribution systems would get improved. So in next 5 years or so, I am hopeful about some of the success stories of distribution companies coming through. Some of the success stories of at least the ascendance of this particular sector will come through in the states where the finances are not that good.
Rajat, same question to you.
Yeah, so I will answer this question a bit more philosophically, actually. But I think if you commercial, we I think what is a good story underlying all this regulation, changes, politics, one good thing probably you are missing. Today, all my country has power, right? Eventually, the end customer has power, right? Whether he can pay, not pay, whether we can collect is something which for policymakers as professionals or governments have to solve. End purpose of electricity is that energy should be supplied to the last person, right? So that goal has been achieved, and I think everyone, whether it is private players, public players, government, needs to take some comfort out of that. The second goal is how do we get them to use more energy to improve their quality of life. Today our per capita consumption is still around 1200 1100 units, probably 40% or 50% of the global average, right? So in a hot country like ours, why should they just be a lighting bulb be constituted power consumption? Why can't they have refrigerators, or why can't they have air conditioners, right? So my hope is electricity as an integral part of in one's life in areas which we couldn't have thought of 10 years back will become a reality. They will also get good quality of life. So that change should not stop, and that direction is absolutely clear, right? What is not clear is in the process, will we have companies which will go bankrupt, which will we have bailouts, budget budget requirement, how efficient we are. That is something which we have to solve. So that my hope is the problems are being addressed. Policymakers are cognizant of that. Capital is now there. Capital was a problem till 2 3 years back, but probably that is a less of a problem now. Innovation is there. My real hope is at some point in time this becomes a movement, right? So today in India, for example, renewable is not a movement. It is something which is required because government has set up. But I hope, and the customer says I need actually green power, so please have, so it should not be RPO based. And this is a change I'm seeing when I see my son. He says, why should we buy gray power, right? So I am hoping that in not my generation, but probably one generation down the line, people are educated enough, discerning enough that the demand for green quality of services becomes so paramount that no one can actually ignore it. So that is something which would be the real success, that whether we can make that change either to the environment or the end customer. And I am very hopeful that we are moving in that direction.
Great. So this has been a fascinating deep dive into the power sector. Thanks Rajat and Mudit for taking out time and talking us through the problems, the solutions, and everything in so much detail. This podcast will be available on YouTube and all leading podcast platforms. So till the next episode, stay safe and Jai Hind.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharatvaarta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.